Hello, everyone. Warmly welcome to this webinar on public procurement and the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD in short. Today's event is part of this year's side sessions of the OECD Forum on due diligence in the garment and footwear sector. So first of all, thank you all very much for joining today. My name is Sofia Kjell and I work at Swedwatch, and we are the organizers of this session. And I will start by briefly introducing who we are, and then I will introduce our brilliant panelist and moderator before I hand over. So Swedwatch is a Stockholm-based civil society organization working on business and human rights and the environment. Our focus areas are responsible use of natural resources, sustainable and fair global value chain, and expanding the civic space. And the heart of our organization is our research and investigation. So I just wanted to make a shout out to our great publications that you can find on our website. For example, a briefing about living wages in the Bangladeshi garment sector, or working conditions in the home textile industry in Pakistan. And this week, we are also launching our new position paper for the revision of the EU directive on public procurement. And we plan to share some of this in an email with you afterwards. Now back to today's session. I'm very pleased to introduce our three excellent panelists. To start with, we have Ulrika Svallingsson, who is a sustainability coordinator at the Public Procurement Office at the city of Malmö in Sweden. There she develops and follows up on criteria in the city's public procurement contracts. She's specialized in labor and human rights, and through the public procurement platform of the city office, she promotes workers' rights. Then we have Sia Urrehman, who is the founder of the human rights organization Awas CDS Pakistan. He is leading the Pakistan Development Alliance that are promoting better governance and accountability towards the achievements of SDGs. And Sia also advocates for putting business and human rights on the agenda in Pakistan and beyond. And lastly, we have Børre Myklebust, who is a Nordic business developer at Sverre W. Monsen, Heiko and Martinsson. In his role as a senior advisor, he has a long experience working with public tenders, as well as working closely with their suppliers on social compliance and environmental production. And Børre is also monitoring and implementing new EU regulation within these companies. So thank you all very much for being here today. And then we are very proud to welcome Laura Travino Lozano, who will be moderating our session. Laura holds a PhD from the University of Greenwich. Her research focuses on how public procurement can be used as a tool to enforce labor rights in global supply chain. She has also been an advisor and director at national human rights institutions in Mexico. And Laura has written many great publications on the nexus of human rights, public procurement, and due diligence, which is really worth checking out. And we will also make sure to share some of them with you afterwards. Thank you very much, Laura, for helping us here today. And before I hand over, I just wanted to present our quite classic agenda for the hour. So first, Laura will be setting the scene around our topic of public procurement and CSDDD. And after that, we will have 3 rounds of questions for our panelists. And thereafter, we open up for some Q&As from the audience, and then we will wrap up at 10 o'clock. And here are just some few housekeeping points. So first one being that the session will be recorded and shared both at OECD and Swedwatch website. Secondly, please share your question during all of the session, and you can write them in the Q&A chat, which is named Q&A So not the chat, but only named chat. And lastly, please be in touch. You have my email there, but you can also easily find it on our website. Yes, so thank you. That's all for me. And I will now leave the floor to Laura.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you for the invitation and for joining the session. I am very honored to be moderating this panel. We have extraordinary experts that will be giving insight about the opportunities and challenges that the CSDDD has to public procurement. And I would like to start by, as Sophia said, by setting the scene of due diligence and public procurement, so then our experts can dive deeper into these key aspects through a round of very flexible questions. Well, without further ado, I would like to touch on 4 key main points to begin with. First, about the importance of public procurement with regards to the CSDDD, then establishing the connection in between the CSDDD and public procurement, mentioning the opportunities that we see in the CSDDD with regard to public procurement, and then having a specific focus or focusing in 2 key challenges that we see not only in human rights due diligence implementation, but that is also reflecting in when we think of including human rights requirements into public procurement. So about the importance of public procurement, well, to start with, and to the audience that is not familiarized with what is public procurement, is a process whereby the public sector buys from private contractors supplies, services, and works it needs to accomplish its function. So it's a public hospital needs 1,000 surgical gowns. So traditionally, this public hospital would have called for a tender and award a contract to the company that offered the lowest price. If we consider that public procurement accounts for up to 40% of a country's GDP in the case of the EU, and we look at this procurement practice of prioritizing the lower tender at this large scale, we find that such practice may contribute to supply chain price pressures that will ultimately incentivize labor abuses as a cost-saving strategy. This is because often labor is a component with the most potential for cost reduction. So the awarded contractor may be the one that has suppliers that pay the lowest wages, have little or no safety equipment or accident coverage. So however, this approach to buy the cheapest offer has been changing into adding other considerations besides the price, like in the purchasing decision making, like environmental or social considerations, such as including human rights and environmental due diligence. This process, or including these kind of considerations, is called as sustainable public procurement overall. And if we consider that public buyers buy it at large scale with a considerable purchasing power, and if they apply these procurement practices involving human rights protection, social criteria, for example, they could significantly contribute to drive more sustainable markets and change, for example, contribute to change, for example, abusive working conditions in which supplies like garment and footwear are often sourced or manufactured. So that gives me to the next point about the connection. We can think, if we think about human rights and environmental due diligence together with public procurement, human rights and environmental due diligence is an enabler of sustainable public procurement, because by addressing adverse impacts on human rights and the environment, which is the core objective of due diligence, we can see that we can contribute to human rights and environmental protection, which is at the core of sustainable public procurement. And we see in this strong connection in the international framework, and we are seeing and we're experiencing a momentum on legislation at the EU level, seeing this connection in EU hard law. On the one hand, on the CSDDD, and on the other hand, on the EU procurement directive. So the CSDDD, in its through its provisions, mainly Article 31, establishes that due diligence obligations or voluntary implementation can be included in public procurement in 3 main ways: exclusion grounds, award criteria, and contract performance conditions. And just also for the audience that's not very familiarized with these kind of terms, exclusion grounds means that companies can be excluded from participation in a public contract at any stage of the procurement process if they fail to meet, for example, social or labor law obligations, such as the ones set in the CSDDD. Award criteria are used to assess and determine that a company will be awarded a contract, for example, and that would have a competitive advantage over another one. For example, a total of 30 points may be allocated to a company that offers workwear with a certification or equivalent label demonstrating the implementation of one or more stages of the due diligence process. And thirdly, the performance conditions is obligations that the awarded contractor must comply with during the execution of the contract. This is clauses that will be included in the public contract, like a clause requiring the contract to identify and mitigate the risks of human rights abuses by suppliers involved in the production of the footwear that this contracting authority is buying. And the CSDDD also established the EU Commission would have to assess whether the public procurement directive needs to be updated in line with the CSDDD. In terms of the CSDDD, we're now facing an assessment that I'm sure that we will be discussing throughout this, not only the side sessions, but also in the main sessions of this forum. We are facing an assessment of the consolidation of the CSDDD together with other regulation, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the EU Taxonomy into one omnibus to reduce the regulatory burden for companies, which is expected to be delivered in a few weeks by the 26th of February. So some say this is going to be this is going to simplify the rules, and others think it might lead to a rollback in regulation. We don't know yet, but we will find out soon. And on the other hand, we have the EU Public Procurement Directive, which I analyzed during my PhD, the potential for implementing social criteria covering global supply chains in multiple countries, like due diligence requirements, into the EU public procurement. And one of the conclusions is that while it is legally possible with the current existing rules, there are many, many challenges. But one key one and very fundamental is that the rules governing social criteria have a domestic focus rather than a global approach to supply chains. So if we think that Italy is buying garment products, the rules are oriented to protect workers, and I'm talking about EU level, they're oriented to protect workers within Italy and not in Bangladesh, where these garment products are probably being manufactured, for example. But currently, the EU Commission, as Sophia mentioned, they're drafting their position paper. They make a call for contributions because the EU Commission is evaluating the EU Public Procurement Directive to assess whether these rules are working as intended. And a key aspect is whether these rules are working to protect human rights in global supply chains, and in which ways the CSDDD obligations and voluntary implementations can be included, or I hope so that they will assess these core aspects. So we will see soon if we can obtain a harmonization between these two regulations, the CSDDD and the EU Public Procurement Directive, which leads me to the fourth and final point that I would like to remark about what are the key challenges in due diligence implementation that are relevant to public procurement. And of course, we can mention so many, but we just have 1 hour, and it has been pointed out, if we only think about human rights and environmental due diligence, we have pointed out monitoring and stakeholder engagement as two key parts of effective implementation, but that are also reflected in public procurement, and they have been widely recognized. So before the panelists delve deeper into these topics about monitoring and stakeholder engagement, I will briefly set the scene by outlining a little bit about how would this look like into public procurement. And they would both involve not only the public buyer, the contracting authority as an active player, but also the contractor, which is the ultimate business supplier who is implementing human rights due diligence. So if we think about monitoring as in terms of the contracting authority responsibility, it would be the activities that the contracting authority will be undertaking to ensure that the contractor complies with, for example, a human rights due diligence criteria established in a public contract. So, for example, a city council purchasing uniforms from a factory in Bangladesh may require monitoring, might have to implement monitoring mechanisms to verify that this is actually being complied with. But on the other hand, we think about the contractor who will have to, it's the own efforts of the contractor to ensure that human rights and environmental standards linked to the public contract are continuously upheld throughout its business operations and supply chains, if this has been included in a public contract. So this could involve internal audits, supplier assessments, and so on. And on the other hand, we have stakeholder engagement, and this concept is still evolving, and there is much to develop around its definition and its implementation. However, from a contracting authority perspective, we can distinguish two main approaches, and really depends on who takes the lead in fostering stakeholder engagement. So if we think about a public body-led engagement, it is about the public authority taking an active role in fostering stakeholder engagement by collaborating with external actors. For example, a city council formalizing an agreement with a local NGO to monitor compliance in decent working conditions in an Indian factory supplying uniforms to multiple city contractors. But if we think, in the other hand, the contractor-led engagement, it would be, for example, the contracting authority requiring the contractor to engage with stakeholders as part of its due diligence obligations. So, for example, a contractual clause mandating that the contractor provides proof of worker consultation in identifying and mitigating human rights risks in this Indian factory producing the uniforms for the contracting authority. So I think we will be delving more into these two key aspects of these two key challenges, and into the detail about what do we see in monitoring stakeholder engagement in the ground with our extraordinary panelists that we will have. So I think that is kind of like a very brief introduction that I would like to, that would lead to our discussions. We will have 3 rounds, as Sophia mentioned, of questions and answers by the panelists, and we will have around 2 to 3 minutes answers per question from our panelists. So if we start with the first round, this is about a general reflection on the CSDDD. And I would like, in starting with an overall reflection, we would like to discuss the opportunities that you see in leveraging public procurement to strengthen compliance with the CSDDD obligations. So I would like to start with you, Ulrika, and reflecting on what the CSDDD can mean to public buyers. As the EU public procurement rules are being revised, what adjustments do you think are necessary to align them with the CSDDD? And how do you think CSDDD requirements could be integrated into the procurement process?
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Well, even though the CSDDD is based on the UN guidelines and the OECD guidelines, and we have been using those for many years now, the directive does not, at least directly, apply to all our suppliers. And one obligation that might be new to some actors and require some additional resources and thought is the explicit focus on a meaningful dialogue with rights holders, which I personally think is great for the actors in the supply chain, public authorities included, of course, to move beyond revising code of conducts and doing snapshot audits, and instead listen to the workers and other stakeholders that have another understanding of the root cause problems in an unsustainable supply chain, and also know if the issues are being dealt with. And not only could this obligation be discussed from the perspective of the proportionality principle within public procurement, but also another issue is that these many times complex problems that we are facing today need to be addressed across the whole supply chain, perhaps across the whole sector, and most probably simultaneously. And And this requires an increased amount of trust and transparency among the actors. And here we have a problem, or at least a challenge, because trust, transparency, long-term relationships, and investments are difficult in our world of public procurement, where our contracts are time-bound. So we need to find a way to work around this systemic obstacle, but perhaps the revised directive on public procurement could look into the possibility, perhaps, of prolonging successful partnerships beyond the usual 4-year limit. And also, it would be desirable if the new directive could clarify that a criteria aimed at guaranteeing such basic fundamental factors as fair and secure working conditions, and that it has a larger margin of appreciation to be judged as proportional, especially then in situations and supply chains where labor rights are vulnerable. So that's my 2 thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, Ulrika. And if you see me, I'm typing. I'm just trying to get the main ideas of these great contributions, so we could do the wrap up afterwards. So thank you, Ulrika. We are going to Bore. So from your perspective, how do you see the CSDDD being integrated in public procurement in a way that is also practical to comply with for suppliers?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that Ulrika said. It's the close dialogue with the market is very, very important. You have to remember, if you look at the Scandinavian institutional textile market, all of the suppliers are small. Then there are not any huge suppliers with a lot of resources. So the first thing that has to be done is kind of to have a dialogue with the market and understand who are your suppliers, where are they, and what can they do. And also to what Ulrika said about the long-term relations, which we see in our in 2008, we did a choice that we wanted to work with a few suppliers, and we wanted to do it long term. And we see the results of that are very, very good. So I think the market dialogue is extremely important to get forward. I mean, we have the same goals. It's just that we have to get there, and then we have to work together. There is no other way of doing it, as far as I can see, practically. As to how to implement it, I wish I could give you a straight answer to that, but I'm afraid I can't. But I think forums for dialogue is the most important thing, how to get forward in this case.
Thank you, Bore, and I'm glad to see also that from the perspective of the supplier, this really also resonates with what Ulrika was saying. So coming to you, Zia, what opportunities does the CSDDD offer to human rights organizations in major garment producing countries such as Pakistan to protect and also remediate workers' rights when they are abused?
Thank you, Lara. I think let me just share with you that in the countries of Global South, where we have been actually producing and this such kind of products are being purchased by the European markets, the overall human rights situation is not good. So what to talk about the labor rights and the other mandatory business and human rights and due diligence processes. The challenge is there, but And then we know that there were like UNGPs earlier, and then we also know that this mandatory human rights due diligence processes, and we also know that particularly in Pakistan, we have witnessed this national action plan that was developed based upon UNGPs and the mandatory human rights due diligence processes. But all these are voluntary. So the major challenge when it comes to the voluntary obligation, nobody cares. And one should understand, particularly in global southern countries, there is a nexus of government and the private sector and the corporate. So they are one and the same thing. So they usually do not bother about these what you call voluntary obligations. So with this CSDDD, I think it would be a kind of mandatory obligation. So it would be it would have a positive impact upon the labor rights in Pakistan, and in many other countries like Pakistan. They will be allowed to have their unions. They will be, following the minimum wages criteria. Right now, we see that they are not that much following the minimum wages criteria. The health conditions are like poor. Overall situation of working environment is also very poor. And when we have actually discussed these things with the corporates over here, with the factory owners, they say that we really don't know about these obligations. So I think with this, for the human rights sector, and when you are asking me about the human rights sector, I think the civil society organization would also come to know about these mandatory requirements. And there will be a kind of investment on the human rights sector, because business and human rights, particularly in Global South, is a new subject. There were like conversations going on, but still the overall mainstream civil society is not aware of these business and human rights perspectives. So this would be, I think, an opportunity for them also to invest on their capacities to understand more about these obligations, and then mobilize the workers and laborers, as well as strengthen their platforms, so as they should follow all these obligations.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, yeah. This is really important, and I will include all these ideas in the wrap up. So you've been discussing the opportunities from we've been hearing the opportunities from this the different perspectives about how to integrate different human rights and environmental due diligence requirements, especially for human rights in public procurement, which it's not only about integration, but also we will need mechanisms to verify that these actual requirements will be complied. So we have the opportunity of integrating human rights due diligence, but also the challenge of making this effective. So thinking more and going through this first challenge about monitoring, which is basically making sure that what we are including into a clause is actually being effective, and it's being implemented, and it's working for all the stakeholders. I will start with a question for you, Ulrika. What are the mechanisms that you think are essential for public authorities, for public buyers, to effectively monitor supplier compliance with due diligence obligations?
Well, until now, our focus has mainly been to ensure that our contract partner works systematically with securing sustainable supply chain by, for example, mapping its supply chain, conducting risk analysis, and so forth. However, as we're very much aware of, and as you pointed out, Sia, this work can be done very well, but still there can be breaches to the core conventions of human rights in our specific supply chain. So my hope is that the CSDDD, perhaps together with the CSRD, can help us as procuring authorities to become aware of best practices for securing genuine and long-lasting supply chains. And then we can convert these best practices into award criteria or mandatory contract clauses. And as you pointed out, Sia, making them mandatory and not optional. For example, in Malmö, within our work with textiles, one of our goals for 2030 is that all production sites from where we source textile should apply living wages. And now we are trying to figure out how to get there, what the criteria like that would look like, how it could be verified, and perhaps most importantly, what the market needs to get there. And as always, when talking about monitoring mechanisms, I have to, as I'm working at the public procuring organization, I think I can speak for all public procurers when I say that there is nothing we love more than broad, comprehensive, and transparent certification schemes. So even though qualitative work is harder to assess than quantitative one, it would be wonderful with a certification scheme to ensure that there are meaningful stakeholder engagement in place, grievance mechanisms, remediation processes. That is key for a sustainable supply chain. And if there already exists a certification like that or on living wage, please let me know. Or if you know who I could approach to develop one, or I don't know, who would like to join in. So, well, certification schemes and criteria that are able to be verified.
Thank you, Ulrika. And certainly it's there are many other public buyers that are also using certification schemes. So having a third party monitoring and verifying that these requirements are actually being complied with, being pointed out as a practical way for public buyers to actually verify that requirements are being met. So going to you, Bori, from your perspective, how can effective monitoring mechanisms be implemented? For example, what means of proof can be provided? Often public buyers say, well, they have been really great in creating development and establishing a lot of requirements, as Ulrika was saying, as award criteria, as contract performance conditions. But sometimes public buyers say, well, this is great. No, as Ulrika said, let's include living wage, but how do we really, what proof can we ask to suppliers to actually certify that living wage is being implemented, and also something that it's not a lot burdensome and it's also practical from the supplier perspective, because we want to make something that's practical and it's agile. We don't want to be burdensome in including this kind of social protections in the supply chains. So thinking about that, how can effective monitoring mechanisms be implemented, and what support do you think suppliers would need to meet these expectations?
Yeah, so even like for us who visit our supply chain quite frequently, we go 5 times, for instance, to Pakistan per year. We also rely on the third-party social compliance certificates. They have all their mistakes and faults and are not perfect. So, but to build on those, like the SA 8000 and the M4E, which are now thinking about introducing living wage, both those, I think is the way to go, because even though you have a big network in a country, you talk to a lot of people, can triangulate information, there is no way I ever will say that I'm 100% sure that everything is okay in our supply chain. That will never, ever happen. But we need, as I say now, the certification that our factories have now is kind of like a ground floor. It's like something to stand on, and the rest of the work we have to do as of today. So I would like to see very strong social compliance certificate, more frequent audits, but also I want to see that we today a supplier have like that export internationally to different markets needs like maybe when you count the environmental and social compliance need maybe 20 certificates to get market access in Japan, in Australia, or in US and Europe. So a consolidations of this certificate would be very appreciated. I think they can be as strict as we want, but to get down the pure number, because sometimes you have suppliers that are audited very, very frequently with different quality of the auditing, but still they have to spend time. They have to spend a lot of money. There are fees on everything. And so that is one of the things that would be, if we could decide on a few really good certification schemes, that would be the best for everyone, I think. So I would say that certification schemes, third-party accredited agencies, is the best way to go.
Thank you, Bore. And you really pointed out something that's very important about how can we simplify this. And some, for example, public buyers are also, how can a supplier with one audit or with one certification scheme can, for example, comply with several public buyers, and at the same time, if they have 20 public contracts with giving the same supplier, for example, and like gowns for universities, it's the same supplier. How can we simplify this to be able to have for example, one certification that will cover or will be useful for several public contracts, for example, right? So yeah, I think that is also key. So going to you, Zia, and also recognizing that there are many challenges as well with audits and certifications, and that of course there are limitations to how much certifications can verify working conditions. What role do you think workers can play in supporting public buyers in monitoring compliance?
Thank you. Very interesting question, and I was also keenly listening to the colleagues. One thing is that in our countries there is nothing like living wages. We are still struggling with the minimum wages. So the living wages is a new terminology that we are using nowadays, and our workers do not know about these things. The second thing is this third-party compliance and social responsibility compliance is something which is like not workable because of two reasons. One is transparency, lack of transparency, and the other one is a lot of corruption. As I told you already, that there is a nexus of what actually the government has to do is to comply with all these obligations, but the government doesn't take such kind of measures that actually ensures the fulfillment of all those requirements. And because of their connections with the factory owners as well as the corporates, so that also links the third parties among, all of them are actually very well connected, and nobody is listening what workers are saying, and workers are unable to share whatever, because they are not directly contacted by any third party. The third parties do not have such kind of measures that they actually reach out to the workers with them meaningfully. So three things are required. One is that the workers should have a leadership role. They should have their unions. They should have their platforms where their leaders are actually elected by the workers. They should know their rights. They should have all that understanding about these CS triple D and MDDHR and then this national action plan. So workers really don't understand all these terminologies and what actually their rights are. So the important thing is that they should have a platform, they should have this capacity to understand all that. And then even if the third party is doing this monitoring process, they should reach out to them meaningfully. This is important. Unless they are actually targeting and connecting with the real workers, they would not have the real picture what is happening on ground. So to me, I think this is important. They should have a leadership role. They should have this capacity, understanding all these instruments, and then they may be actually connected well with the monitoring organizations, suppliers, maybe not suppliers, but the buyers and their representatives. So this is important.
Thank you so much, Zia. And you really touched into really having not only building capacities, but also sharing knowledge and connecting public buyers with workers. Do you think this could be, for example, and just as a follow-up to this question, do you think human rights organizations could be a platform that could connect public buyers and workers to meaningful stakeholder engagement? And I will go to you, Bora, next. Yes, yeah.
Okay. So yes, of course, I think this is important. And as I shared earlier, that in many of the countries, the mainstream human rights organizations are not uh, aware about these business and human rights instruments. So it's important if we invest on them, the mainstream human rights organizations will be a connection with the workers. Right now, we have seen that many of the labor organizations are not functional because of the overall civic rights situation in our countries. But if we have those opportunities where the mainstream human rights organizations have this capacity to understand all that, they will definitely mobilize and help the buyers to reach out to the workers. In most of our countries, this GSP plus status is also very, very critical and political. And I know that most of the EU delegations are reaching out to the mainstream human rights organizations, but still, this is my concern that the overall mainstream human rights organizations do not have this capacity to understand all these fundamental instruments, particularly this new one on CSDDD. So there is a need to invest on the human rights organizations so as they can transfer that knowledge to the worker, and then maybe worker be engaged and the obligations be fulfilled.
Thank you, Zia. And I think we are already touching into this third round about meaningful stakeholder engagement, and you already mentioned some of the challenges, but also some ways to really establish dialogues. Bora, if you have a brief input, so I can also ask you about another question about stakeholder engagement, but please.
Yeah, it's like I do agree there are a lot of problems, and that's why it's also very difficult for us as well. You have to really understand the region you are in and the workers that work in the factory. So presence in the supply chain for our part is very, very important. We need to be there a lot. We need to know the faces. We need to know the people who are working in the chain. And we have started working now with what we call social dialogue, where we try to find out what do the workers in the chains know about a lot of different topics to kind of like gauge the how informed they are about their rights and so on. I mean, you can have all the placards that you go to every factory. They have walls filled with all kind of of rights and everything, but do they understand it? Do they read it? And that is also a way to try to figure out where are they at and in your supply chain. And then we have to, like I say, I cannot single-handedly change a country. I have to focus on my supply chain and do what I can there. And that's also goes back to the longevity, that you have to stay with your partners. If your partners, where you find that you have a common goal, eventually some mutual trust without being naive, that is kind of like the line that we have to balance, trust and mistrust at the same time, if you understand what I mean. So that is kind of like the difficult line that we have to walk on at the same time. But I think that, yeah, figure out the level of line workers. What do they know? That is a very important work for us going forward.
Thank you, Bora. I think you already touched on this question. I was going to ask you about what are the challenges in this stakeholder engagement and how to overcome them. You're mentioning about information, trust, and also social dialogue. And I would just want to ask you if you see any other way to overcome these challenges into establishing this stakeholder engagement in the garment sector with workers, or how to, if there are key elements of stakeholder engagement that actually makes it meaningful besides these elements that you already mentioned about and knowledge.
I mean, the problem that I see, because we are, for instance, a factory where we are a big player, we are also in a position of power, and everybody knows where their orders come from. They come from us. So the difficulty is for us to get the objective, correct answers from a worker in the line, that he's truthful and tells us exactly what it means. And to build that kind of like that he can talk to us and tell anything he wants, that's quite difficult because they know where the orders are coming from. So that's why we also have to use NGOs or something, or organizations to kind of, where they can feel free to talk more freely than what I would suspect I would do to me, for instance, since I am a buyer and I have power over their work. So that's also a balance that we have to go.
Thank you, Bora. But yeah, I think that resonates also with what Zia was mentioning about the fundamental role that human rights organizations can have in the field and in raising workers' voices. So lastly, I will go with you, Ulrike, and then we will open up the floor to have some questions from the audience that I think it has been very, very insightful, all your contributions, and I'm sure there's many comments in the audience. So if you can prepare your questions also in the chat while we answer to the last question, but try and to include the questions in the chat, and we will be hopefully addressing them all by our extraordinary panelists. So going with you lastly, Ulrika, what are the, and I'm thinking about what Zia mentioned and Bora mentioned about what is going on, and also about the limitations that obviously contracting and public buyers have often in stakeholder engagement. What best practices could contracting authorities adopt to make sure there is a meaningful stakeholder engagement in place?
Well, yeah, we must understand what is not working in our supply chain in order to be part of the solution, of course, and by examining our purchasing practices, business models, and the effects of our contract clauses. Today, the problem, as I sometimes understand it, is that our suppliers are reluctant to report to us about breaches to our criteria, even though we might be part of the problem. And we, on our part, we invest resources in trying to understand, okay, what risks does this supply chain might contain, and if the risks are materialized. And I'm just sure that there must be a more progressive way of to make use of these resources by, for example, engaging in dialogue with suppliers and rights holders, but not as monitors, but as partners. Because if we can't understand the problems and the priorities of the workers and other rights holders, then how can we drive change and combat corruption, for example, as you mentioned, Sia? And also, this might be the way to ensure that there are genuine grievance mechanisms and remediation processes in place, which of course is much easier said than done. But maybe these components together, the dialogue, the grievance mechanisms, and the remediation processes, it can be triangulated in some way and combined. And I'm thinking about the way that, for example, Electronics Watch is working within ICT by engaging local NGOs and trade unions. And that is how we work on a local level here in Malmö. We have ongoing dialogues with, for example, trade unions that are very, very important to us. Because it gives us a chance to act on specific issues and not just roam around in a very theoretical or like level. And since we live in a global world, I'm sure that these conversations can take place even though we are time zones apart. But of course, this requires a lot of resources also from public procuring authorities. And then we have to have in mind that we are not focused in one sector. We're buying like range, like we're constructions, groceries, garments. And that's why I'm very fond of the model of the Swedish regions, where they have divided different high-risk sectors amongst themselves. So they are one region is taking the lead in, for example, on textiles, and another one on ICT. So I think that is what we procuring authorities need to do. We have to cooperate more, and also to touch upon what you mentioned at the start, but and not to also lessen the burden for our mutual suppliers. So we ask the questions once instead of 10 times. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Ulrika. And yeah, that is key. I think you mentioned a key point about collaboration amongst public buyers into to lessen the burden into all the activities that you have to do, also in terms of monitoring and the inclusion of third parties like international organization, resonating a little bit with what Boris said. Sophia, I don't know if we have questions on the chat. I really can't see them, but
we do. Some. I was trying to summarize them. I think you have actually answered many of them by this conversation. I think one thing that people are worried about with having maybe more of this mandatory due diligence requirement is if this would benefit bigger companies, and how can public procurer work with that risk. So maybe I put that out to Berra and Ulrika just briefly.
Or I can just firstly mention that that's a big risk, and and that's why we are so keen on looking into how to formulate criteria that could be available for many suppliers to comply with. So we are not so we're not making it more difficult for smaller suppliers, which of course which are important cooperation partners to us as well.
Yeah, I think it's a important focus to have. I don't think that smaller suppliers should have like less. You have to have a control in your supply chain anyway, who you are, or else you should not be in the business maybe. But it's a challenge with all the regulations that are coming now, just to get an oversight over them and comply to everything. It's quite difficult. So there is a danger also in the producing countries as well, in Pakistan, for instance, where you have environmental demands and stuff like that will be only applicable to the big mills that have the money to actually comply with everything. So the smaller players will disappear maybe. So that's a risk all over the supply chain that can happen.
Is there any other questions, Sophia, that we can maybe have?
Can I come in a little bit,
Please.
on this?
Please.
In fact, this is what I have observed is that mostly the suppliers are working in a great depression and fear of losing the contract if they do not comply with. And most of them, while we communicate with them, most of them are saying that these compliances are coming to us abruptly, and we really don't want to delay in complying in all these compliances. But if they inform us timely, if they educate us on those compliance requirements beforehand, so as we can comply with them. So mostly, in our observation, they are quite under pressure. So to me, I think the buyers and the public procurement authorities in Europe, they should actually invest on reaching out to the suppliers and to the civil society and human rights organizations in the global south, so as they can be informed timely, so as they can comply with those requirements. So this is one challenge that we have found out in our conversations with them. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sia. And I think there are plenty of more other questions, and we have so little time, only get to cover in 1 hour. So I think we just have 1 minute to make a brief wrap up, and thank you for your insights. So you mentioned about the overall perspective. It was mentioned that first of all, there is need of trust, transparency among actors and long-term relationships and investments that sometimes get into a challenge into the limited time of a public contract. The importance about dialogue with the market and understanding the market to be able to implement all these requirements, and also about that the requirements is making the requirements mandatory is key also to have effective implementation and to inform workers and international organizations and local organizations about this requirement. So a lot about capacity building. In terms of monitoring, and I would just briefly finalize with this, you mentioned about there's still ways of looking how to verify, but also the element or the role that certification schemes can play for monitoring, but also for stakeholder engagement. And finally, about how workers can really be connected with public buyers and the key role that local human rights organizations can play with building trust, but also connecting into knowing what is going on at the factory level and the ground level to raise and include workers' voices into the entire procurement process and with suppliers. So with that, I will thank you so much for your relevant insights. Thank you for the questions. I think, Sophia, there might be a final closure to you. So I just give you the floor, and thank you so much for the invitation and the insights.
Oh, thank you, Laura, and thank you for that amazing summary. I just want to say thank you to everyone that has been here today, and especially to you, Ulrika, Sia, Börre, and Laura, for making this interesting discussion. And like I mentioned in the beginning, we will share some good readings as well as a summary of the session with you, hopefully by the end of the week. And this session has also been recorded, like I said, and you can find it at the OECD website, but also at Swedwatch websites. So once again, thank you to all the panelists and to Laura. And yeah, that's it. Have a nice day. Please be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks for
Ciao,
having
ciao.
us. Bye.
Thank you.
Ciao.